So shalom and welcome. This is Rabbi Shawn, and welcome to Mishkan Shalom's Live and Learn series. Today we have two wonderful guests, both members and leaders in their own right, Billy Linstead, Goldsmith, and Rabbi Julie Greenberg. They're going to introduce themselves in just a couple of moments. And we're continuing taking a look at a variety of issues with a social and racial justice bent in this initial part of the series. And so we're going to take a lean into environmental justice and sustainability in today's program. So as always, I want to start with a little spiritual centering. Those of us here who have gathered, at noon Eastern time are in that particular zone right now. Others of you may be watching this at another time. So whatever time of the day it is for you, there's always an opportunity just to breathe in or let ourselves be breathed by the universe. Nishmat Kol Chai, the breath of every life, just to center and recenter, reboot ourselves. It's like we start the day and then the GPS can get a little bit thrown off, and we have to hit that recenter button so that we don't go too far off the path of our life goal and mission. And so for today, I want to offer, draw from the Psalms and Psalm 19. And the fact that this was particularly designated, it's attributed to David, for the leader. Right? That aspect of from the very top as well as in the field, that we're to be mindful of these things, but especially those of us that are responsible for leading other people. The fact that this psalm is designated to remind us of within what we serve and whom we serve, I think is a powerful statement. And it draws from the heavens and spreads across the earth. You will recognize the melody, hopefully, and on mute, if you can just all mute yourselves, you should feel free to hum along too. The cosmos declares your glory. The atmosphere weaves your handiwork. Day to day speaks of you. Night to night shouts out. There is no utterance, no words whose sound goes unheard from the world. The voice goes out through all the earth. The words to the end of the world. You can see the glory in the sun, coming like a hero eager to run, rising at one end of heaven. Nothing escapes this heat. Hide, 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 One of the many psalms for leaders, for everybody, reminding us that we are Adam and Adama, we are of the earth, we are earthlings first, even before gender is assigned to us in the Torah. And of course, in Genesis 1, gender itself is non-binary to begin with and only gets separated in the version of creation in 2. And the other thing I wanted to mention, I've had debates with people and colleagues over the years here about the very beginning, the template of creation, and the presentation of the arrival of humanity on that sixth day, and the charge to have dominion over the earth. Now, that is one translation. Thank you very much, King James and Pepys. But that represents a certain Old English and not necessarily the Hebrew, because remember, we come from the Deep East and the Middle East, where the idea of mastery, right, is not the same as dominion or domination. So if I'm at the ashram or the Buddhist temple, I'm dealing with the master, or I'm in the Eastern legacy, the idea of having mastery is to be in alignment and harmony as opposed to having power over and above. And so while sometimes we can wrestle with or reject that idea of, wait, Genesis 1, the whole creation story says we arrive and then we start to dominate everything. What would it be to hold that very charge to humanity, to the earth people from the beginning, to develop the skill and mastery with the earth as opposed to upon it? And so with that having been said, I want to give both Billy and Julie a moment just to say, hi, this is me, and take us into your thoughts. And Billy, you won the coin tossed, at the hashtag hash mark of the field. So why don't you go first?
Sure, thanks. Thanks for
Forgive me in advance. I may every now and then kind of stick in and go kind of, oh, what about this or what about that
yeah,
to dialogue with you, but please take us away.
yeah, please do. Yeah, and thanks for the opportunity. I love what you just said. The idea of mastery. Another way people have tried to kind of soften the dominance term is stewardship of the earth, but even that has a power dynamic in it where mastery is more with than over. So I've never even felt comfortable with that idea of being stewards of nature or stewards of the earth. So I appreciate that perspective around mastery, and just that puts us in a position of needing to constantly learn more and be in more harmony with, rather than kind of dominion over or stewardship of. So um, again, I'm Billy. I'm the director of Fair Trade Campaigns, which is a fair trade advocacy program in the US and tied to a global movement around fair trade advocacy. But before that, I came to that work through environmental advocacy and environmental action. So I worked for Clean Water Action. I ran the Philadelphia outreach office for about 8 years. I've now been on the National Board of Directors longer than I worked there, and I'm also on the state and local steering committees. So that organization is focused on primarily, first and foremost, protecting the waterways of the U.S. It was founded by the guy who co-wrote and helped pass the Clean Water Act in 1972, which was the first ever federal environmental legislation. So that organization's roots are deep in both the political process of the U.S. and the environmental movement, and has increasingly over the last several years, under the leadership of our current CEO and support of the board, to really look both internally as an organization and externally on the role of environmental justice and environmental racism. So, for many, many, many years, the environmental movement was very focused on pristine, clean, nice looking places, very nice air, led and focused predominantly on benefiting people in power, and not recognizing the inherent systematic racism embedded in where companies and factories are located, what communities get dumped on, both with actual waste and air quality. We worked for years in Philadelphia around the refinery in Southwest Philly, and worked with the community there. We formed one of the first bucket brigades in the US, where it's community members with air testing, low tech air testing capabilities to really empower community level activists to kind of take the lead. And that's one thing that Clean Water Action has always focused on, is supporting grassroots organizations. And so there's always been tension within the organization on the fact that we're not often recognized in the media, but that is by design because we want the grassroots partners we're working with to build their power and build their recognition and notoriety. So it's been really enlightening to move into that space over many years. And then now, as the entire country and the world's focus is shifting once again to racial justice and inequalities and systematic marginalization, to be able to continue to grow and lead and learn at the same time in those spaces. And so too in fair trade. So fair trade is a certification for products that primarily come from outside of the US, predominantly from what folks problematically considered developing countries. And it's a system that ensures equity throughout trade relationships. So fair trade standards cover social, economic, and environmental sustainability. One of the things that I've observed as being a sustainability professional for 20 years now is sustainability was really equated with environmental for the first 30 years of what we now call the sustainability movement was always the environmental movement. And that's great. I mean, we have a lot of work to do on the environment, especially with threats like climate change. However, if you think about sustainability as a tripod, or a three-legged stool, those three legs of the tripod would be environment, social, and economic sustainability. And we have essentially built an unsustainable sustainability movement because the environmental leg of that tripod is about 30 feet tall and the other two legs are about 10 feet tall. So unless we're looking at sustainability more holistically and understanding that, especially in rural agricultural production, in urban factory production, in countries that have not had the benefit of strong environmental laws and regulations, those communities are not in a position to safeguard the environment if they can't feed their families. If you don't know where your kid's next meal is coming from, you really don't have the luxury of considering what outputs are going into the river because of your production. And so fair trade is one of several systems that seeks to kind of right-size that tripod and make sure that we're able to invest as consumers directly in the people behind the products we buy, rather than have all of that money and that purchasing power lost through the exchange of hand after hand after hand of middlemen. So it's an effort to really build more direct market access for producers to the U.S. market. And I can get into some of the functions that ensure that, but there's a lot of pieces of the certification program that are very strong on the environment, but really focus heavily on ensuring that communities are set up and organized through democratic processes so that resources can be distributed equitably, and that producers are paid fairly for the work that they do.
As you were speaking about that, Billy, I wonder if you could comment on, and you're someone who's been helping us at Mishkan as well, think about this as well. We did engage with the Chazon Seal of Sustainability program, and we're given that, though, as all of us say, well, that was like an impetus, not a conclusion. And we kind of, pre-pandemic, we're starting to get some momentum of re-engaging that, and I hope that we'll be able to continue that work. So even the designation, then the question of maintaining various practices, ensuring who's at the table and those voices is one thing. So that's within an added Jewish environmental context. The other piece I wanted to add and get your thoughts on in this regard is in the 1980s and early 90s, I was involved with a social educational theater company that I'd helped start in Toronto, and we actually did some work around Great Lakes environmental education based on Grow Harlem Brundtland's 1988 sustainability report to the UN, which actually posited, it added a fourth leg to the square stool, which was environmental, economic, social, and political sustainability. And there are those of us who have been involved in the ecological or ethical Jewish perspectives of
I'm
that.
on my way to your son's.
So we got somebody
Not
there.
yet,
If
but
we
in a
could
little
make
while.
sure that you're muted, please.
Mhm.
Okay, give me 1 second here. Quick look see.
Mhm.
Okay. There we go. See, it's a struggle environmentally. There's always something that's going to distract us, right? So that part of our would add a fifth dimension to that, which is, or maybe not even a fifth, but an all-encompassing piece of soulfulness or spirituality. And so even when we look at classical kashrut, for example, the emergence of more Gaian or cosmological thinking, the adding or reclaiming of justice categories such, as ethical and ecological ones. How are the animals being treated? Should vegetarianism be the real kashrut? At Mishkan, we just leaned into having no meat in the building and keeping it, vegetable, fish, dairy, etc. And looking at some of those, where we get the food, how it's served, etc. Not so much the classic kashrut categories that we don't require of people, but having people engage on that level. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about those dimensions as they interweave as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, especially on environmental work, environmental justice, the political side is critically important. I will say the fair trade movement has pretty intentionally leaned out of politics. And part of that is around lack of faith in our federal government to reliably steer certifications. So an example is organics, right? The organic movement was very fractured. What organic certification would mean for farms and for production in the U.S. Was very fractured. There was a really contentious moment in that movement, and actually leaders in that movement asked the FDA to step in. And now genetically modified things can count as organic. Given the influence of industries and special interests in politics on the product certification side, fair trade has been very hesitant to do that. Now, where there's an exception to that is that we do, through my program, work to engage with municipalities and cities around the products that they source. I mean, ultimately, the products, anything that's purchased by any level of government is our tax dollars. And we talk the same way with college and university students who are trying to shift sourcing on their campuses to fair trade products. Is that's your tuition money, right? We have every right to have a say in what systems are finances that we're providing institutions, how they spend that money and what systems that money supports. And there is no in between, right? When we make consumption choices, when we spend our money, we are investing in one system or another system. And those are it's one of two, so either the products we're buying or the energy we're purchasing or the cars we're driving or whatever, they're either supporting ecological, sustainability and justice and equity, or they're not. At that level, at the municipal level, our advocates are working to push for more ethical sourcing through procurement policies and procurement decisions and things of that nature. And then, through the more spiritual lens, I mean, spiritual communities and faith communities have been at the heart of these movements and at the, the foundation of, I would say, every social justice, civil rights, environmental movement we've ever seen on this planet, probably. I mean, you can, pick a social movement, and communities of faith are part of the foundation, part of the bedrock of that. So, I see all of these movements as an opportunity for us all to, to really live those values that, that we draw from our faith and from, our teachings, whether that's, a more strict interpretation of scripture and religious values, or just kind of more broad spiritual perspectives around, just a holistic view of our role as as humans, having the opportunity to have mastery, with nature and the earth and all that lives within it. And for many of us, we know we need to overcorrect on the people that live with it, within it, because a lot of us have the luxury of sitting in our homes, right now in a pandemic, in air conditioning in the summertime on Zoom and having these conversations. And, the vast majority of us don't even have something like this within reach in their dreams. So, that's where I really have appreciated the opportunity, especially through fair trade with an environmental background, to really get an opportunity to understand and work in that kind of the sustainability of the sustainability movement, and making sure that we're looking at all of those dimensions has been an incredible opportunity. And, again, through kind of the green team and, Chazon and that work, that is another very holistic looking program, right? I mean, it's everything from food that's sourced at your congregation to the grounds, to energy use, to they really do try to take a holistic approach to sustainability. And I think all of us that worked on that at Mishkan were really drawn to kind of the range of options and the range of actions that can be taken within that program.
Well, let me ask you one more question for now, and then Rabbi Julie will bring you in to surf on that wave. And as you were giving your own drash on what I said, Billy, which I really appreciated, it was exciting to think about it. I thought of another passage from the Torah where it says, when you get to this place of promise, as long as you align yourself with the core values and the balance of humanity, for some people that may say God and mitzvot, and I'm kind of, bringing it down to a more universal perspective here, there will be no one in need. And in the same paragraph, and because there will be some people in need, here's what you need to do to correct the system. And by the way, concludes the paragraph, there will always be people in need, so you always need to look out for them. And now in the Western mind, that might seem contradictory. In our ancestors' mind, the aspect of holding polarities or even values in conflict was the understanding of the complexity of life. And so one could make a statement of aspiration, compensation, and ongoing monitoring and maintenance without thinking that was contradictory. So as you were speaking, I think it would be, if you could help us think about how we deal with some of the contradictions. You've raised the economic sphere already. Who has access to what resources? The Maslowian hierarchy, like if I have no meal on the plate. I remember once through Jewish Council on Public Affairs taking the 30-day $1.50 a day food stamp challenge. And, the emotional variance of that, within my privilege, of course, but going into the grocery store and having $1.50, it wasn't just that it was, well, what am I going to find to eat? But how am I going to eat healthily here? And the emotional waves that kept over as I walked by almost everything except for the items that almost self-selected themselves was, almost incapacitating on some level that way. So I appreciated that exercise because it wasn't a mathematical one.
Yeah.
It was a psycho-spiritual aspect of empathy and get that this is what it's like to not have these resources. And at the same time, we need to do what we can do. And even within the racial justice movement and our own Reconstructionist movement that is focusing on racial justice this year through our Tikkun Olam Commission, I keep on bringing in the environmental justice like a little bit of a fly, around the apple there, sort of saying, and we can't let this go because who ends up being next to which refinery, or who gets most exposed and has the impact to rising sea levels and so on. So I'm wondering if you could just speak to how we wrestle with those contradictions and still move forward. Even someone may say, well, I've got kosher chicken, and we may say, well, were the workers paid, or what are the conditions of that? And that doesn't meet one standard, whereas it meets another. And then what are some of the things that we can do so that we don't give ourselves a pass to say, oh, it's just too much, or we don't run into a wall and not feel we know what to do. So, in 2 minutes, respond to all of it.
Well, I think a couple of thoughts. One is, I appreciate that wisdom from the Torah, because I don't believe that our purpose is to get us to utopia, right, where there are no problems and everybody has everything they need and all of that. That would be lovely. I don't believe that's our purpose. I think our purpose is rooted in struggle, and that it's the work that really reveals who we are and how we operate. And without that tension, how do you avoid complacency if there's no problem to solve, if there's no tension? And I don't believe complacency is the place we want to be as a society and as people. So I think thinking about the actions we can take while working to drive systematic change is for me the best way to live that, right? So we have consumer choices, right? We buy as much fair trade products as we can because we believe in our family that that is an immediate action we can take to help rectify injustices and inequalities in systems of trade. That said, capitalism is rooted in racism. Capitalism is a white supremacist structure. So we also need to grapple with that. But I can't do anything today to topple capitalism and reform the way the world does business. That is a slow and steady, that's the slow and steady work that we all collectively need to be working in, and to expose those elements of the systems that we're all a part of that are rooted in systems of supremacy and in racism. But that doesn't mean that we should not take those day by day actions that can help drive incremental change while we're working towards and looking towards holistic change. And that ties both into the spiritual approach to things as well as the political. I am absolutely voting for Joe Biden. I also absolutely believe that a two-party Democrat-Republican system is both rooted in racism, supremacy, and classism, and that we need a different form of democracy for us to get where we need to go. That doesn't mean that I voted for, I'm not thrilled that I could only vote for, Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders in the primary through being registered as a Democrat. I still made those votes. I will still do everything I can to get this current person out of office and to elect Joe Biden. But that doesn't mean that I holistically and wholeheartedly endorse the system that those actions are embedded in. And so I think that for me and through the advocacy program that I run, we try to hold both of those things and not lose sight of the big systematic changes that are needed and actions that can get us to those shifts. But also understanding that there are people in desperate need of immediate assistance, and the things that we can do right now to help them meet their basic needs are just as important as figuring out the solution to these giant systematic changes that we need to see over time.
Wow, thank you. Thank you for holding those both up for us. I think demonstrating how to embody the tension and not just seek to resolve it.
Yeah.
Or make the easy choices.
Yeah, I'll say
And
just one more thing that I'll just say, because we just had a conversation about this. We have a team of fellows as part of our program, and they do a couple of projects every year. It's a 13-month fellowship, and 4 of them just presented to us the work that they were doing around fair trade and racial justice, developing a whole suite of resources for our advocates. We've really been focusing on that space for several years, but of course, ramping that up over the last 6 months. And one of the things that they brought to us and that I applauded and said, we absolutely want to follow this approach, is the importance of encouraging people to sit in the discomfort and in the tension of it, right? One thing that's resonated with me as I've learned more about how to be not racist, but an actual anti-racist, an active anti-racist, is disassociating the kind of judgment around the word racism and the word racist. People flee from that because they feel like it has to identify them, whereas you can have a racist thought and then an anti-racist thought. You can take a racist action and then not a racist action. It can be this moment-to-moment struggle, especially for people like myself, white folks of privilege. But it's fleeing from that judgment and the meaning that people have associated with that word racism and racist, that's the easy out, right? We've got to be able to sit with the discomfort of knowing that we and I have racist ideologies embedded in my DNA and in my upbringing and in my lived experience. And until I'm willing to sit and recognize that, I'm going to be in a position where I'm running away from it. And so I think that is part of that, like being willing to sit in the tension and get past the discomfort of it is the only way we can kind of analytically, dissect it or, autopsy it in order to learn from it and figure out how we can do better. And so I think that's true also in what we were just talking about is what are the immediate actions we can take? What are the big systematic changes we need? And as we look at our own role in that, how do we get past the fear of that discomfort and that judgment and that tension and get comfortable with kind of sitting in it so we can figure out how we can take the most strategic next steps to drive change.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you, Billy, very much. I think you gave an artful segue to bring Rabbi Julie in, because in many ways, as you were summing that up, you very much characterized who I've known Rabbi Julie to be. You know, being from you, Julie, I've learned, you know, the primacy of pastoral nature, of the relational dimension to what it means to be a spiritual leader and spiritual community, while at the same time you're out on the front lines organizing for justice, or, you know, raising a whole brood of kids, or, you know, making sure they're looked after in the world while you're being there for friends. And I know it's an overwhelming piece. It's not an easy piece, but I feel that in your work you hold the micro and the macro, both as the rabbi now for a couple of decades of Lev Ha'ir, the Reconstructionist community at the heart of the city in Philadelphia, and now the last few years on Power, Philadelphia and Organized to Witness and Empower and Renew, our statewide now social justice faith organization for climate justice, the portfolio that you hold. And you're very sweetly also a member of Mishkan Shalom, you know, in your off time. So we have the blessing of your leadership and participation. So why don't I hand it over for you to, you know, to pick up, you know, just a little bit about yourself that way and your own journey and your perspectives on these issues.
Thank you, Shawn, and thank you, Billy. Well, Mishkan, for starters, has been integrally involved in power, really co-creating power over the last 10 years of power's existence. And some of my early journey into the climate justice world actually was shaped by Mishkan Shalom, in that I was kind of a gender and racial justice person. I grew up in the civil rights movement, spending time in Mississippi in the 60s for a couple of years in my childhood. My mother was a freedom fighter. And then I was a leader in the gender justice world of feminism. And I always said, oh, environment's not my issue. You know, someone else can do it. That's good. It's just not my issue. And like about 8 or 10 years ago at Mishkan, there were a series of workshops about climate crisis. And my eyes began opening to how absolutely dire the situation is. And I realized that I wouldn't really be able to face the truth of what was true if I didn't have a very, very strong circle of support. So I turned to the people I was working with in power day in and day out at that time on the economic dignity team. And we were in the streets after the Michael Brown verdict, and we were working for living wage, shoulder to shoulder. Those were my buddies. And I turned to these people and I said, do you guys want to look at this with me? Let's look at it together. And they were mostly retired Black church ladies. And they said, well, we don't really think this is our issue. But if it's important to you, we love you, and we'll learn about it together. And we sat for a year in my living room, month after month, and we learned about climate crisis. And we started asking the question, well, how does this impact the people we're already working with in Black and brown and low-income communities? And we took layers of maps of the zip codes in Philadelphia. So like one on how invested are the schools, like what's going into the schools, what's the incarceration rate, what's the unemployment rate, you know, what's the asthma rate, what's the average age of death. And we layered these visually upon each other. You can see them in a kind of slideshow called Change the Climate that's listed as a resource on our Power website under the climate justice tab for campaigns. So we layered these zip codes. And it turns out that exactly the same neighborhoods that are so burdened by these other justice issues are also massively impacted by environmental racism and extreme weather. So these are the people who already are dying 20 years younger than the next zip code over that's a privileged and much more white zip code. It's just shocking to look at the map of Philadelphia. So anyway, we all stepped in together. And I always say, you know, if you can organize the bingo game at your church, you can organize the revolution. So we became buddies. We created Power's Climate Justice and Jobs team. And what we tend to be is like, when we're working in the environmental movement, like with the big greens, we are the equity flank of that movement. We're the people who are talking about using a racial and economic justice lens. And what does this mean for specific communities that are impacted by environmental racism? But in the racial justice movement, we are the climate flank, where we're kind of saying, well, you know, climate crisis is just going to add insecurity to lives that are already massively insecure for housing and food and employment and everything. So climate crisis adds a cumulative level of burden to that situation that's already there. So we launched into it. And just one of the things that we're working on right now, which is going to be a project that engages us over the next many years, well, it gives an example of the difference between just an environmental program and a climate justice program. So I'm going to say something about this. Right now in our state, there's something moving called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. It's called RGGI, R-G-G-I, as its acronym, RGGI. And RGGI is a 10-state carbon market. And this year, our governor, Governor Wolf, put Pennsylvania into this 10-state carbon market. We're the last state to join it. And the idea is to tax carbon emissions, because carbon emissions, the fossil fuel, is what overheats the planet. So carbon emissions are causing global warming and climate destabilization and extreme weather like hurricanes and floods and heat and cold beyond what we've ever witnessed on this planet as a human community. So this carbon market, the goal is to tax carbon and reduce carbon. But if you really think about it, if you're in a 10-state region and you sort of generically reduce carbon, that is good, but it doesn't really matter to the people living next to the toxic fuel plant that's spewing out emissions into their neighborhood and polluting their kids' lungs and giving them pulmonary disease and susceptibility to COVID and all the things we're seeing. The people who are right there in that specific place need the environmental racism right there to be addressed, not carbon to be reduced overall somewhere else. And so we are engaged in really a struggle for a fair energy future right now. And Pennsylvania right now is in a 2-year rulemaking process about how this carbon market is going to work. So we are at that table. We're there with the governor, with the Department of Environmental Protection. We're organizing in our communities to do teach-ins and whatever. And partly the stakes are that RGGI is going to bring in $400 million a year to Pennsylvania, which in a way it's a drop in the bucket, but in another way, it's really a good piece of funding for a green transition. Because if you're going to have a green transition, there's lots of costs to that transition, and somehow it has to be funded. And where's that money going to come from? Well, one place it could come from is this carbon market. But the questions are things like, who's going to get to make the decisions about it? Who's it going to harm? Who's it going to help? Where is that investment going to go? And so we're just partnering with our own communities to help people dream big about that reinvestment. If you had $400 million to build a healthy community on a healthy planet, what would you do with it? And that includes everything that's also interconnected. It includes green space, urban gardens, education, job training, investment in solar and wind infrastructure. It includes transition money for the workers who have to leave the fossil fuel industry and will need new jobs. It includes transition money for the local governments that have been funded by tax revenue from the fossil fuel industry. So they're not going to have libraries or public schools or anything unless they have some alternative funding. So what would we do with that reinvestment? Who would we support and where? And who will have a voice in it? And that's what we're working on a statewide level for the next few years. We really welcome you guys to come partner with us in that. We have a monthly climate justice and jobs team. We'll be meeting this month, actually. Well, I won't even say it here because this is going to live beyond into the future, but you can contact me or you can check the Power calendar. But every month we do a training on something in our monthly meetings. This month it's environmental racism. What is environmental racism? And we connect people in local communities with opportunities to have a collective political voice at points of leverage, like public hearings or candidate forums or legislative assemblies, those kinds of things. And we really invite everybody. All hands are needed. It's a multiracial, multi-faith movement. We welcome everybody in. And I'm delighted to be talking about it here. It's really, really important. Thank you.
One thing that strikes me already is that while you and I have been, shoulder to shoulder over a number of years in this work, just hearing you describe this already adds a level of nuance. We've even been into some of the same meetings, but you're kind of drilled down on it and working in the way Billy was also talking about, in the home, in the neighborhood. And also we've been side by side, at the energy companies in their lobbies, and sometimes getting the boot, or the escort out, whatever it may be, and keeping that, global heating up on the organizations, not just being heated by what they do. I did see an announcement, one of the major companies investing today at $1.2 billion to divest themselves of carbon products and plastics in what they provide. I'm forgetting the name of the company right now, but as those things start to happen more, and as people say, even one of the major oil companies, I've heard the CEO talk about, like, we're moving in this direction because there's also a niche there, and if everybody else is resistant, that's going to leave us, being able to shift into more alternative energies and survive this and retool in a way that's more sustainable for the planet. So, one thing that struck me when I did, and this relates to things you were saying, I did a little analysis in my pension portfolio one day, because I have a socially responsible portfolio. And I said, let me see, there's other ones there. Let me do a comparison. And what struck me is 90% of the companies in the socially responsible portfolio were the same as in the non-socially responsible portfolio. Meaning the ones that, I won't go into names, but the pension company was looking at that were the most viable were the same ones that were looking at gender equity and environmental equity and social and racial and justice pieces. So sometimes it feels that there's an obscuring that takes place where it's, breaks apart the stool, as Billy was describing, whether it's 2, 3, 4, 5, or 20, however many legs you want to put on it, that's, well, no, this will suffer if we do this one. And then it just perpetuates that imbalance. And even within the restorative justice, some of us are involved in some of those conversations and taking a look at what is a restorative justice for African-American, Black people in this country for centuries of enslavement, and what needs to happen for that to be just. And what I appreciate what you're saying too is you pivot according to where the emphasis needs to be. So there's been some buzz in those conversations I've been at is it a matter of just resources, or should those resources be coming from a place that's more damaging to the planet, because that also impacts people of color more than white persons in our cities? Or should it in fact be given with some directive that then the spending power of that be used in certain ways that don't contribute to further devastation, which is a very, how do you deal with when there's injustices already baked in, and yet you don't want to contribute to more of that. So I don't know if there's anything, before we open it up to our esteemed participants here, anything you can, say about those pieces as you've been grappling with them.
Yeah, I'd like to say that, right now, I think Billy was also referring to this. We live in the context of an economy organized by a relentless drive for profit at any expense, over people, over planet. People and planet are not the priorities. Making money off of money is the priority. And so in this economy, that principle, in a capitalist economy, that principle drives every single decision. And in thinking about, well, how are we going to transform from getting from where we are now to where we want to be? I so much think all of these approaches are important. We need to be building alternative institutions like the fair trade movement, like Weaver's Way Co-op, like mutual aid societies, because we have to be able to govern. Like when we win, we have to be prepared with our own caring and, our own caring economy, really, basically. So we have to be prepared. And at the same time, if we only build alternative institutions in the belly of the beast, but we're still surrounded by the beast, we're going to constantly witness throwaway people, throwaway places that the overall economy doesn't value. Marginalized people who needs them, put them in prison, or just disinvest in their schools and job training and homes. And, and so throwaway people in places don't matter in a capitalist economy because they don't have money. I mean, think about why children don't really matter, why schools don't get funded. Children don't have any power. They have no money, basically. I mean, they're sort of lucky if their parents have money and can advocate for them. But the vulnerable, the very elderly, look at the very elderly. I mean, look at people who are disabled, who are sick, who, if you think about who doesn't matter, and who doesn't count in a capitalist economy, it's because some people are considered it's okay to sacrifice you, and some places are considered it's okay to sacrifice you. But we're actually building a world where we need everybody. Everybody does matter. We're all interconnected into the whole. We need all the places. We need the forests. We need the ice caps. We need the grasslands. We need the oceans. We need it all. There is no throwaway place and no throwaway person. And so, as we kind of think about transformation, we need to be ready to govern, so we need to build our alternative institutions. We also need to do emergency relief right now, and one of power's big issues right now is no utility shutoffs. Like in the middle of a pandemic, you're going to shut off people's utilities? And what kind of consciousness is that? So we've won a 3-week reprieve on any utility cutoffs from regulated utilities. There still are many utilities that are not regulated and that are cutting people off already in the state of Pennsylvania. So we're working on like emergency relief just to help people survive while we kind of get through the days, and that's important. And then we've really got to work on the political transformation. We need to build power, and that's a big part of what power does. We build power. It's each one reach one. We organize congregations. We amplify the power by bringing more and more people in and invite you to organize your people and bring them in. And so it's an organizing movement to build public power, both in the streets and in the voting booth. And so, as I'm sure, as you all are quite aware of, that's next couple months, we're primarily focused on just getting out the vote, because that matters so much in moving things forward. So all of that.
Thank you. Thank you. No small matter. And yet I feel so inspired listening to both of you, because the way you hold the multiplicity of those dynamics, notwithstanding that each of us will have our Saturday more energetic days. And that's part of holding that continuum too, the emotional valences that accompany this work. Being able to just see the chemical chart and the alchemical chart together can lift us up. And the differentiation between being falsely optimistic versus claiming hope, as the psalmist says in Psalm 27, which is a daily feature of this month of Elul, have claim strength in hope, trust in that, not just in the results of, what you're given. And I remember wrestling with that at one point and seeking some guidance from rabbinic commentaries on Psalm 27, because the idea of just have hope, trust in God, it'll be okay, was not resonating in my soul anymore. And I was amazed to see when I looked at this old book in the Reb Zalman Library of Elat Chaim Isabella Friedman Retreat Center, dusted it off, and below the line of the psalm, one of the commentaries was, how can we be asked to keep on keeping on, my interpretation, to keep that hope in the face of so many of the things that we struggle with that do not come to pass, that fail, that end up being broken nonetheless. And they say it's because hope is not a quid pro quo. It is not a product that I pray for this and therefore this arrives and so I can trust the universe, and if it doesn't, I cannot. Rather, that we will never be left by God to feel embarrassed or ashamed for having hoped at all. And for me, that was just, it lifted me up out of the place that I was feeling less mobilized by, to say, my hope, my keeping on with the struggle and with the work that you're both talking about will not leave me, ashamed or ridiculous for having had that at all. In fact, knowing that can keep me on. And I remember in the 1990s doing, and late 80s and 90s, beginning to do environmental education. And one thing I noticed, and I think both of you are artful in this too, is information and statistics do not transform the world. So we would go into schools, we'd go into houses of faith, and we'd start with the story of the Big Bang. We'd even throw comically a little bit of the biblical story in there as well, just, to have a dinosaur talk to Adam or whatever it may be. And there was all this energy and enthusiasm. And then we got to the early draft, had all the statistics of greenhouse gases, of melting, this is already decades ago. And you could see the little bodies in the school wilt. And when we said to them, now let's break up in workout groups and think and brainstorm how you could do things. What have you learned? What could you do locally? How you might get involved in change? No one wanted to do it. When we stopped and did the workshopping after the initial grandeur of the evolution and complexity of the universe, those kids were so charged. They came up with their own responses as well that spoke to the details and statistics we had not yet given them. So for me, that alignment of having that spirit and that energy is not just a cutesy thing or a bypass. Rather, it's a way of tapping into the soul that is of Earth in that way and keeping us energized to do the work around energy. So having said that, I know we've got a number of folks who have joined us today. I'm going to stop the recording.
Like fair trade as one of those kind of immediate actions we can take to ensure that impact is being driven as we work to kind of revolutionize and change the way our society functions. So when we talk to folks, there's often an initial kind of mistaken contradiction in people's minds between buying local and buying fair trade, because fair trade products are coming from halfway around the world a lot of the time, and local products are down the road, and food miles and all of that. And so they are actually incredibly complementary, right? I mean, it's the same, you're trying to extend the same values of buying locally and supporting local producers, extending that to kind of the global marketplace. That said, you may be buying locally from a farmer who is using underpaid migrant farm workers in their field and spraying Roundup on their fields, right? That buying local does not intrinsically mean healthier, fairer, or any of those things. And similarly, you may be buying organic tomatoes grown in Arizona, when it's not harvest time in Philadelphia, and there are, 5,000 food miles on those tomatoes. So ultimately, we have a big issue around the role of consumerism and really, again, kind of this monetarily focused capitalism that is part of the kind of systematic and root causes of a lot of the issues that we're facing. And within that system, exercising our opportunity as consumers and operating in consumerism with as much effort and as much focus on ways that ultimately we hope will transform those systems, I think is the opportunity we have. So, being part of a CSA or, going to a farmer's market and not just, buying things from local farmers, but asking them about their, their farms, asking them about, how far away they are, asking them about, the employment, that they have on their farms. Similarly, independent third-party auditing and certification can do that for products that you don't have the opportunity to ask, the cocoa farmer from Ghana, about the beans that are going into the chocolate bar that you're buying.
One of the things that we realized sort of early on is that there are no individual solutions. We need to have sort of a collective process. So you can individually not use plastic bags or not drive your car as much, or, don't take the little receipt from CVS because that's a piece of paper and it might create litter. Those kind of individual solutions, even just individually recycling something or using less of it, they're really not going to change climate crisis or the future of humanity on the planet. So when you work collectively through something like a co-op or a fair trade society, or, if you work collectively to pass a law in the state of Pennsylvania that changes the legal framework for how we're allowed to produce and share energy, then you open up possibilities. So it's really all about collective solutions,
Yeah.
not individual solutions.
And that's what we talk about all the time in fair trade. It's that the more consumers are choosing fair trade products, it's the signal that sends to the, to the sectors of the economy
Yes.
that are the most important part of that, right? So as we increase massive volumes because of consumer choice in purchasing in the US, that sends a signal to the market that consumers are demanding more sustainable products. And then when our folks go out to meet with those businesses and talk about supply chains and sourcing and talk about consumer demand, those are all the different levers you can pull. Fair trade also builds more sustainable supply chains because, not surprisingly, in increasingly climate challenged locations where a lot of the food that we purchase and source from internationally comes from, those communities are being uprooted and are, the more we're investing in their sustainability, just from a business perspective, the more reliable your supply chain is, right? And so there are all these different kind of levers we can pull to influence these systems, and the choices that we make individually, as Julie was saying, roll up to those signals. But it's the same thing where, we get into these conversations about climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, and the system is so adept at focusing us on our individual choices and things like, the Green New Deal is going to outlaw hamburgers because of cow farts and stuff. If you roll up the impact of us, if you are of people who eat meat in this country, and the impact of that on climate change versus just the 5 biggest energy polluting companies in this country, it is a speck. I mean, it is nothing compared to what industry is doing. So to Julie's point, it's that collective action that can send those signals that demonstrates, until we get to a place where we're willing to regulate things on a humanitarian basis, that shows that it's good business to do right by the planet and the people on it.
And it really meshes well with Jewish values and teachings, because what the teaching is, you have to join something bigger than you. And Judaism's a pretty communal religion where we're always joining something bigger than us. It's always about the us, not just about the I in Judaism. So it's a nice alignment with who we are as Jewish people and fellow travelers.
And here seasonally, though this does locate us in this moment in time, we're preparing for a new Jewish year where we will use that language. And even on Yom Kippur, where we will say, we missed the mark here and there in this place, not because I individually may have done it, though I may be contributing unconsciously or consciously, but because I live in a society, a community, a world in which these things are still happening. And so I have some responsibility to not sit this out. We got time for one more. And Lior, I know you wanted to say something if you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Rabbi Shawn. So when Rabbi Julie was
perspective there, really important. And we still live in a democracy, and although capital shapes the law, because the law is shaped by the people who have the money and who basically pay for the elections and the candidates and the campaigns, so capital does shape the law, but there is the possibility of people power matching that, and democracy actually making decisions to rein in that kind of corporate drive. So democracy could tell Walmart, you have to pay every worker $15 and they have to be in a union. The democracy has the right to say whatever the rules are for the operation of these businesses. And it's an organizing job. So, I mean, and even democracy itself is just very, very threatened right now with creeping fascism, sometimes not even creeping, but bulldozing fascism coming down the line. So there's a lot of struggles right now. It's a scary moment for our country and for people who want to be alive. And it's, we've got to join together and make a difference, because this is our moment. If not now, when, right? I mean, yes, we need to make democracy work so that we can shape our communities on this planet in ways that will actually allow us to thrive.
Legislative fight is one of the avenues, one of those levers that we have the opportunity to play. And we've seen other ways that corporations get capital, like Blackstone's investment firms say, we will not invest funds if you are not focused on kind of that triple bottom line B Corp promise. And so, that's another space where, sure, shareholders could sue if you're shifting your focus from, profit at all costs. But also, you can make the case to your shareholders that you're losing investment from some of your most important capital providers if you're not making those choices. So again, I think it just goes back to all the different levers, kind of that holistic approach that needs to happen for any major shift like this to occur. Hop off and jump on a work call. I think I'm really glad you brought that up, Paige, because right, we're talking about the problems of capitalism and the exploitative nature of the way capitalism is exercised in this country. And that is rooted in the beginning of this experiment of this country, which was instigated by a genocide of people who have on this continent had more of that mastery with the earth that we were talking about at the very beginning of this conversation than anybody who's inhabited it since. And so I think it's no coincidence that we have marginalized and systematically abused and displaced the people most connected with what is being exploited for the purpose of profit and capitalism. And so it's just, maybe to bring us a little full circle, we started talking about this idea of mastery with the earth and its people. And so, I think it's kind of appropriate to make sure that we're honoring those on this continent who have had that more than, most of us can even contemplate or consider. And so I think we really need to center Indigenous peoples. I'm really encouraged by the increasing, if you look at the kind of growth curve of Indigenous peoples in Congress, it was this for our entire history, and now is essentially this. It's not enough because it's only a handful, but entering the leadership of this country and the work that those communities have done to lift themselves up, to defend themselves, the work that's been done in opposition to the pipelines, I think has really done a great service to everybody's awareness. And, as we talk about people of color in this country, Black, Indigenous people of color is the term, that BIPOC. That was never the case. Even 3 years ago, that wasn't an acronym people were using. So I'm encouraged by the seemingly dramatic increase, but also recognizing that it's not nearly equitable or nearly enough of what we need to see. And the case of Bolsonaro and Brazil is.
I'm going to say like 2 sentences just to add on to that there's a lot of really amazing and brilliant Indigenous leadership of the climate justice movement. If anyone wants to find out more, check out Red Nation. And we now talk about the Black, Red, Green New Deal, not just the Green New Deal, but the Black, Red, Green New Deal that draws from all these sources. And it's really an astounding synergy of people working together towards this vision.
Thank you both for addressing that and for us creating a chatima, a sealant on this conversation. And I want to also recognize and give honor to the Lenni people whose land we are on that was originally theirs in this moment in time, as the full circle brings us back to Adam and Adama, where we began, that we are named as earthlings from the earth itself. That is our original name before it gets specified into genders or personalities, and that at the core of our tradition and with the psalm that I began with is trying to remind us. I don't even use the terms on the land or of or on the earth anymore because I feel it's disjunctive, whereas I feel we are of the earth, or we like the tzitzit, the fringes that extend from the planet, the little cilia that interface that way. So just take a moment as we close here and come back to breath where we began. And it's a moment to let settle in, know and trust that the holy conversation, the Sikha Kedosha that we have had, whatever's meant to stick with you in this moment in time will remain. Don't hold it too tightly and squeeze it out. And whatever's been meant to create dis-ease, to agitate your soul, trust that too is that deep voice of the cosmos saying, come my way if you want to remain whole and feel balanced in this world. And so the sound of the shofar with its clarion call to gather our consciousness and action together, with the short blast to break open the heart from the places we may be numb or frozen or hardened, into the many, many cries of species and people and the planet asking for our attention, to the Tekiah Gedolah, the great call, where we unify our energies for the greater good of all in this planet. Thank you so much, Rabbi Julie, Billy, all of you who have joined across multiple time zones. Stay tuned. We'll upload this in the near future as part of our growing library on mishkan.org. We can see the Live and Learn series. And blessings, and I pray the sweetness of this new year to everybody. Be well. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.